Hey everybody, so I played Florence into Italy, and it was actually kind of a different, unique run, much different from the Hesse run I was talking about earlier, in which we had lots of unique content for Florence, and I figured we'd just make a video talking about it, because the last video got a decent amount of views and the watch time was actually pretty good as well, so a lot of you guys actually liked watching the video and at the very least didn't click off it instantly, which I kind of thought you guys would when I didn't really have anything to show on screen. And as I continue to say, we don't really have much that we can show. We're not allowed to show any gameplay footage until the beginning of next month, so this is primarily going to be talking about Florence, and as compared to my Hesse run, which started a very rural run, not very rural, I mean Poland and Muscovy are definitely very rural, but this was a very urbanized run without much rural land left in Italy, as most of it starts as a town or city right as we get into the game start. So we are, throughout this video, I don't really have much that I can show you guys, obviously, so this is very pixely. It's the best I can do. We're going to be using that in combination with some other things to kind of set up Florence and all that, and I would suggest you use this mostly as a podcast, not really as something you actively watch, second monitor, or while you're driving or anything like that. That would work best for this video, and that's gonna kind of be how I recommend it. Okay, let's talk then about Italy. But before I go further, I always need to remind myself, please make sure to like, please make sure to subscribe, and as always, please make sure to leave a comment on your thoughts on anything here, anything at all. These just help me immensely. And also, when I get more comments, I can kind of be like, here's something I could work with or respond to and actually interact with, right? So, okay, let's talk about Italy. I know this is very pixely. It's the best I can do. Florence is this guy right here. Yeah. And Florence, Italy as a whole, started very well developed, very well populated, very well urbanized, pretty much richer than the rest of Europe right at game start. The Renaissance is going to start picking up right after game start. The exact date of the Renaissance, I mean, some people don't, like, some people think the Renaissance was like mid 1300s to 1500s. Some people think the Renaissance started in the 1400s. It's really going to depend on who you talk to, which historian, you know, blah, 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 blah. Some people have even tried to separate it into the Renaissance and the Proto-Renaissance, but the general idea here is that Italy has finally become urban enough and it's finally become well developed enough that we're starting to really advance technologically, artistically, things like that, right? And Florence is going to be right in the middle of this, with several prominent painters, inventors, things like that coming out of the city, that despite its small size compared to a lot of these other powers in Italy, that it actually managed to do a lot, if not maybe militarily, but culturally to the world. Okay, right as we start the game, Florence is not very much in a great position. You can see right here next to it, or maybe you can't see, that Verona, big bad Verona right here, who I'm hoping they make content, better content for actually dying. Verona has expanded a lot throughout Italy. They've taken lots of vassals, they've taken lots of areas, and Verona is just being quite irritating to everybody around them. And Verona, as historically happened, well, I should say what happened historically is Verona got coalitioned by Milan, Venice, and Florence, the big three, and it was basically reduced to, I believe, just only Verona, something like that. And that was basically the end of Verona. Now that allowed Florence to continue to expand, to eventually form Tuscany over the next 100, 200 or so years, because they no longer had this outrageously powerful North Italian power that was kind of constricting them. Again, Florence just militarily is not going to be able to compete with these much, much larger North Italian powers. Okay. As you go into Florence, they do have a unique law that gives them a bonus cabinet seat. The problem with that law is it gives you something like an outrageous negative 25% peasant satisfaction, which is really hard to get around. Florence's day one unique inventions, or I should say advancements, are a pretty powerful one that gives them 10% tax efficiency and -1 cost of court. Now, tax efficiency is really, really, really good because basically everything goes into tax. You've got tax and you've got trade. Even production efficiency will just feed into your tax by increasing the worth of a province, and then you tax that province. So let's say a territory has a tax base of 100, which should be really, really high. You don't get 100 gold, but what happens is then you tax the pops in that territory, and based on how much you're taxing them, that's how much gold you get out of it. And then the tax efficiency will just directly increase that gold as well. So tax efficiency is really good. Now, cost of court is also really, really good. Both these modifiers are outrageously good for starting to generate that infinite money into the late game. So the fact that Florence starts with both of these modifiers is very, very good. Now, cost of court, despite it only being negative 1%, you need to think that cost of court is effectively taxing your total income. Well, I mean, it's not effectively, that literally is what it's doing. So by reducing the amount of taxes by 1%, that means that you just get 1% more of your income to actually work with. I believe that's how it works. So Florence just starts with these two modifiers, and they start with an extra cabinet seat. Politically, let's say Florence at this time just seems to be a very peasant-hating area. I don't know a better way to put it. Florence actually has a looming disaster coming from the fact that their peasants basically are being taxed to death and can barely even afford to eat. Right at game start, Florence also has some good modifiers where they can have more fine cloth output. Milan and Florence get 10% more fine cloth output, so these are definitely these are the areas that can be producing that fine cloth just better than everybody else, right? And the disaster you're having is pretty much unavoidable. So I've played Florence a few times, and this is all before I've even gotten into the game, right? I've thought about whether or not I want to try to avoid this disaster, because while the disaster is active, you need to, you take like a huge stability hit, and you need to generate a lot of stability to get out of it. And while you're in that disaster, you take a huge hit to your fine cloth output, as well as some other effects that will just generally reduce the amount of money you're able to make by a pretty sizable chunk. Now, the disaster is, of course, historically solved by the Medicis, who came in and heroically put down the peasant rebellion and got them back to being starving and poor. Heroic Medicis. The Medicis are, of course, also simulated in the game, but right now it's a little bit broken. The banks around you will bankrupt, which allows the Bank of Medici to rise. That is actually in the game. That is an event. There is a Bank of Medici. There is the family Medici. And once you do win, or yeah, I guess once you win the disaster, because there's not really a way to lose it, but once you win the disaster, you can put a Medici on the throne. Of course, the problem here that people have noted and reported is that because republics cannot marry family members, because they're not really supposed to be in the whole marriage game, the Medici family can often just by chance not marry and eventually die off. A lot of people like the Medicis, they prefer the Medicis, and simply put, them dying off is definitely a detriment to people's enjoyment of a country like Florence. But moving on here, starting Florence is pretty simple because you're a very urbanized area. You've got your city, you zoom in really, really far into this Florence area right here, and you just start building books, because there's any urbanized area, you're always going to get books, because you need books in order to get libraries. Libraries allow your pops to promote faster, because baseline, you're only promoting like 15, 20 pops a month, which means over the course of an entire year, you might get enough pops to fill one building, which is obviously not enough. The library improves that by 10, which means you can definitely use a lot more. You can definitely build up your city, Florence, a lot more. Florence itself starts a very populated, large city, which does mean with the Black Death looming, you want to get as many estate privileges as you can onto your burghers, because then if your burghers are at 75 loyalty when the Black Death hits, you're allowed to use the Isolate Cities decision. Isolate Cities makes all your urban areas significantly more resistant to the Black Plague. That might get adjusted at some point, people have talked about it, but for now it makes you significantly more resistant to the plague, seemingly to try to simulate with Milan, what Milan did, because during the Black Plague, the family in charge of Milan, I cannot remember all these Italian families off the top of my head, but they were outrageously powerful and actually owned every bridge into Milan. And what they managed to do, the city, not the state, just the city of Milan had all its bridges raised, and anyone who was found with the plague was shut in to a building and sealed within it, presumably to die. This is what I'm going to assume the decision is based on, the Isolate Cities decision. Milan only suffered 10% casualties due to the plague, so they got through it very unscathed. Now, the decision to isolate your cities is very, 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 very powerful, but historically speaking, it's the only problem I have with the decision is that it would basically be taking a very extravagant historical example and trying to apply that to everybody. So, for example, if everybody could be Napoleon, or everybody could be Alexander, or everybody could be Caesar, then it wouldn't really show how different and really over the top these examples were, right? And Milan being able to do this was kind of above and beyond. Nobody else really managed to do what Milan did. It was kind of very unique and isolated to Milan. They just managed to raise every bridge. Anyone that got the plague, they managed to shut inside a building. And so I don't think everybody should be able to do that. However, without the isolated cities, you suffer outrageous penalties from the plague, particularly as an urban environment, which it's kind of a, yeah, but at any rate, this is all going back to the fact that the burger loyalty needs to be at 75% to isolate your cities. So you want to open the game and give them as many privileges as you can. But remember, each privilege you do give them lowers your legitimacy, or I guess in this case, your Republican tradition, because Florence is a republic. They do have the Sortitian government. Or sorry, not Sortitian. They have Sortitian, but they have Signoria. There's Signoria and Dynastic Signoria. Dynastic Signoria is very good, and that one's just a free government reform. Signoria is not good. Not good at all. So we want to get rid of that. And it's actually, you'll see how we do that in a little bit. It's a bit silly, but whatever. Okay. So, you give as many privileges as you can to the burghers without trying to piss off the other estates. You could give a bunch of estates to the burghers and one to the nobles and more to the burghers. You don't want a noble rebellion. It's fine if you get it. You can then increase control. I got a few noble rebellions, but when you're a very small country, they don't tend to take much land and they tend to get put down very easily. Of course, the downside is your control is reset to 0 after you put down a rebellion. So they need to go to your cabinet. You need to start increasing control with one of those cabinet actions, and it can be a whole deal. Because, for example, why am I bothering to have a law that gives me a cabinet seat for some huge debuff on my peasants if I'm just going to be using that cabinet seat to be fixing the rebellions I'm having due to having my peasants not like me and rising up every so often, or my nobles or anything like that, right? Okay. So you just, I guess what I'm saying is you don't want rebellions, but it's fine if you get them because you can easily put them down. Now, Florence day one is a bit locked because the Pope is going to be expanding northwards. Milan and Verona are going to be trying to expand southwards, and you're left right here. You're militarily the weakest nation in Italy of the big ones. We considered Naples, Pope, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Venice, Verona. If these are the big nations, and Florence is definitely the smallest dog here, but of course the neighbors around them are even weaker. Florence has a pretty good spot though where they can advance into a bunch of cities. Pisa in your west. Pisa is a city. You've got Siena into your south. So between Florence, Siena, and Pisa, you've got 3 different cities that you can take pretty early on into the game off some Parliament CBs. You do have the Guelphs and the Ghibellines situation where you'll generally just side with the Pope, feed as much tax base and power into the Pope side as you can until eventually everybody leaves the Holy Roman Empire. Then once they leave the Holy Roman Empire, you lose the malice. Right now, if you start the game, everybody's in the Holy Roman Empire. The big reason you want everybody out is because you generate 75%, I believe, more antagonism for expanding within the Holy Roman Empire, which you don't want that because that's not good, because that just makes everybody coalition you before you're able to just fight off all the coalitions. So you sit there in the Guelphs or the Ghibellines, I think. It's one of the two. I should really remember this. I side with the Pope, and that's the Guelphs? Or the Ghibellines? I think it's the Guelphs. If I'm wrong, sue me. And then you just sort of slowly expand. You move down and take Pisa, you move down, you take Siena, now you got 3 cities, and you can start heavily building these urban environments. But as I said last in my Hess video, you need to remember how food works. The more peasants you're promoting into a burger job, the less food you're actually, gaining, because peasants produce food just by existing. So you're producing less food, then you've got your burghers who are now eating more food, and so slowly and surely you can cause yourself to have a food crisis if you're totally ignoring food. So the best time to start managing your food problem is now, because as I mentioned on stream when I was streaming a little bit, it takes you a very, very long time to set up all your food provinces, or I should say your food territories. Because if you really want a food territory built up, you're going to need all the wheat RGOs out of it. So like if you could build 12 wheat on a territory, then you're going to need to build 12. And if you start at 1, then that's 11 you need to build. And if it's on a river, you can build irrigation. There you go. That's the word. I was going to say aqueduct, but I was like, that's not right. You can build irrigation. Irrigation gives you a 5% food multiplier. Then, of course, you can build farming settlements, farming villages, which give you another food multiplier on top of producing some livestock, which will also produce more food to then be multiplied by all these things. You can produce outrageously high food output territories, but you need to set this all up. If you need to build 10 RGOs, 10 irrigation, 10 farming settlements, then of course you're gonna probably take about 10 years to set that all up. You cannot in a pinch just be like, oh shoot, I'm out of food, click a bunch of buttons and spend gold or take a loan or whatever, and boom, now you have food. You have to be managing the food problem the entire time. And obviously in Hess, I set up some food territories, but it wasn't really that big a deal. We were pretty much always able to keep ourselves on par with food without managing it that hard. In Italy, we were running into constant, recurring food problems where I was buying a lot of food while desperately struggling to keep it down. There is some really good wheat provinces in Italy, but even a really good wheat province can feed maybe a city and 2 or 3 towns when there's a lot more towns and cities than there are really good provinces for food. At any rate, we expand down, we take Pisa, we take Siena, we start setting up the 2 wheat provinces we have. Now, of course, we only have 2 wheat provinces to try to feed all this stuff, but we manage as much as we can. Obviously, we're going to have to buy food, which buying this food cuts into our income. We have the choice of, if you look here, we of course got the market here. You can see Genoa and Venice. Which one do we go with? I go with Genoa. I'm not sure it would have been better to go with Naples or Venice or Genoa. I mean, one of the 3, right? Obviously. But we're right in the middle, so we kind of need to make a choice. When we ask the market leader for market preference, then we get more push into their market. And of course, we can get most of our country into one market or the other. And I actually think you can get into all 3. I went with Genoa because it was the richest market. I don't know if that's the best decision. I'd have to play it again to figure it out. But at this point, that's when the disaster hits. Now, Venice's disaster is pretty unique. The ways to get out of it are to slowly raise up your stability while debuffed, which is not very fun and takes a while, or you can be a peasant republic. Now, the peasant republic for Florence is their non-historical option. Whenever you have a decision, or I should say whenever you have an event, you have like the historical option and the non-historical option. We, of course, went with the non-historical option to become a peasant republic. Now, a peasant republic massively powers up your peasants at the cost of taking power away from your nobility. Why did I take this then? Because I'm a very, very, very urban country. And when you're that urban, all your peasants are either going to be promoted into laborers or promoted into burghers. And despite the fact that it massively powered up my peasants, it didn't really matter. It didn't do anything. And Peasant Republic has a rather very, very strong 10% production efficiency. So effectively, I used Peasant Republic to remove my Signoria government reform, which I just don't think is very good, and instead my major government reform became Peasant Republic. Now, you won't always have a major government reform. You just can have one, but only one at a time. Peasant Republic became my major government reform. Not every country will have a major one. In fact, I think the majority of countries won't have a major one, but Florence at least does have one. It isn't a historical option. You're not actually supposed to do that, but I just quickly thought to myself, well, wait, I can actually just totally ignore the debuff here, this massively overpowered peasant estate, because I'm just going to promote them all to burghers anyway. And we ended up with a hyper-powerful burgher estate that was now using 10% production efficiency. So now we had 10% production efficiency, 10% tax efficiency, but all my money was unfortunately being drained away by food and the fact that I just wasn't built up enough yet. Florence does start. The entire Tuscan, I should say Etruscan, whatever you want to call it, area does start with roads on it, pre-built at game start, so you don't really need to waste gold on that. In fact, you don't need to waste gold on it at all, which is pretty useful. So all our areas had pretty much good control, but our population was pretty low for an Italian. I think we only reached about 1 million pops at this point, so it wasn't that much compared to the other countries in our areas. We could not raise up nearly as many levies as they could, and we had to really avoid fighting them, because of course when you don't have that many people, you don't want to be fighting death wars. It doesn't do good for your populace when they're all dead. So we just sat back and we built and we built and we built and we built, and eventually we got the food situation under control, and by sniping all the little Italian counts around me, we managed to slowly but surely actually increase our power. Now, I avoided getting a standing army because I just didn't think that fighting big battles with such low pops was going to do me any good, that I would just end up killing too many people to get as much advances as I could. But we got as many theaters as we could, because remember, when you get theaters, that increases demand for goods, because you need goods to maintain your theaters, which then allows you to supply those goods so you can keep increasing your economy. At this point, I think my income, I'd been stuck at about 20 income, despite these crazy modifiers to tax efficiency, cost of court, and production efficiency. I just couldn't really seem to get my income to go up. And we were stuck at 20 for a while, and then we were stuck at 30, and then it was 40, and then it was 50. And eventually, once I did, and we were stuck here for maybe like 20, 30 years because I couldn't really figure out a good way to expand without killing all my populace. I know lots of other people have formed Italy really early, but I didn't want to just form Italy. I didn't even want to really form Italy at all. I wanted to get as strong as I could, and killing all my pops to just conquer a bunch of people, sure, you get strong by just conquering a bunch of people, but you don't really get stronger as a country. You just get a bunch of land that eventually, sure, you can sit there and core, but in the short term, you actually end up quite weaker. So I did snipe, and we continued to snipe, count. We sniped as many as we could until eventually the only thing we could really do, as we controlled most of the central Italian area, was pick a fight with one of the larger countries. Now, I thought to myself that Verona didn't look that much stronger than me, so we declared war on Verona, who had taken a lot of the Genoese coast up here. They'd just taken this whole area, and we declared war on Genoa, and we pushed up, took the forts, and everything was going great until we realized that Genoa actually had a far larger army than I thought they would, and they outnumbered us like 1.5 to 1, 50% more. Not really a winnable battle. So we had to back off and come up with a better plan, which I noticed that my vassal was just sieging down Verona's cities, and I thought, okay, well, Verona has 2 forts to go through before they reach my capital, so let's just trade sieges. And that's what we did. We just traded sieges for a bit, and fortunately I managed to get a bit of luck on top of, I think Verona canceled one of their sieges because yeah, I'm remembering this now. No. I used my army as a heroic distraction, definitely intentionally, by having them walk up, and then Verona ran off the siege and destroyed my army. My heroic intentional sacrifice, fortunately, I disbanded and re-raised my levies and went back to sieging Verona, and because my vassal had just been sieging him the entire time, eventually he did peace out once we took his capital just for the coastline, We didn't actually manage to beat him in any pitched battle even once, but nobody likes to sit there and be sieged down. It's not great for your economy. So we just took the coastline, which he didn't directly own, but it was all vassals right there. And we didn't really get much out of this one either. We had to integrate that land. There was a good food territory in there, which we continued to use to feed our people, but there wasn't really much being gained here. So eventually we did need to go spend our time advancing down the professional army side of the research, because I'd been trying to get as much money and cultural advancement as I could, universities on every province. We had gotten our research rate absurdly high. Our literacy was absurdly high because we had gotten so many laws and advances out of the Renaissance and banking side of the tier 2 tree. But eventually we had to go back. We had to get a standing army because our levies were just not large enough. We needed to actually start dunking down into armories to get a large standing army because we actually needed to fight and win. Shocking, I know. But we continued to annex the vassals that we had taken, which increased our cores, which increased our power, which did actually increase our levies. We actually did manage to get our army. I think we were starting to raise 20,000 troops after the end of this due to sniping some of Verona's land and continuing to take a land up there. We were about equal to Verona. And then I noticed we were actually significantly stronger than Genoa. So before I even raised up my standing army, we just walked over to Genoa and we took Genoa from Genoa. I didn't really have enough cultural capacity to accept more cultures because I'd already accepted Median. I had already accepted because I was Tuscan, I believe. Etruscan, I don't know, one of those two things. And we had already accepted Emilian. So we had Emilian accepted, and I thought, like, I just can't accept the Genoese culture. It's called Ligurian. So I had to take one of my cabinet actions and I had to start culture converting Genoa so I could actually court more successfully. But as we continued to build our standing army and we continued to core Genoa by culture converting and integrating it, we actually got a really powerful army. I got a standing army of around size 20,000, so I didn't even need to raise my levies. And its quality was really bad. Really bad. Really, really bad. My standing army, I think, was probably actually weaker than just having levies. But it did kickstart our economy. Our economy through having these goods needed to supply the army and then having the goods being built in our country to supply the army. Our income just shot up. I think at this point, the production efficiency and the tax efficiency, when we started to produce this many goods, just kickstarted it into a new age. Now we do have the fine silk output as well of Florence. So fine silk output, production output, tax efficiency. The fine silk that we had out of Florence, I think we had 22 tailor guilds in Florence producing an absolute insane amount of tax base and income. In Florence, the city itself was like somewhere around 150 tax base, which is very high for a city before you start getting the better buildings and the higher ages, right? So our income in total shot up to like 150. At this point, I was just starting to slap down every building onto everything. We were running out of peasants pretty much everywhere as I was employing everybody. But even as I was running out of peasants, we were, of course, able to continue to take more cities off Genoa, off the north central Florence area, this area right up here. And just through continuously building, our income just continued to went up and up and up and up and up. And at this point, we were able to use our standing army to expand into Ferrara, Mantua, and at this point we had pretty much everything except Milan and Verona itself, at which point they really didn't stand a militaristic threat to us. Although our army quality was completely abysmal and we took way too many casualties in battle than I would have liked, it was pretty easy to swat aside Verona when they were outnumbered 2-1. The Florence army, which I think I had formed Tuscany at this point, heroically managed to win any battle where we outnumbered our opponents 2-1. We just had to avoid battles where we didn't outnumber them 2-1. The army quality of these Tuscans was not nearly as much as I was hoping for. So I integrated as many vassals as I could, because, or I should say annexed as many vassals, and we pretty much owned all of central Italy up to the north. The only really didn't own was Milan and Venice itself proper. So I took Verona, I gave it to a vassal, and then we just beat up Milan, and we gave Milan to a vassal. These were not very hard to do. I did it piecemeal over about 2 wars each, 2 wars with Verona, 2 wars with Milan. Now, Milan, I couldn't eat all of it, obviously, so in one war we took most of their southern territories. In the next war, we took Milan. Of course, they were kind of shoved off here to the left, but if we went any further, we would have gotten coalitioned way before my army quality was good enough to fight a coalition. Age 3 hits, we start getting the Aquabussers and the Halberdiers. Now, once you do have those 2 unit types, I think that you can pretty much start fighting coalitions, because at that point, I think standing armies start outqualitying levies. Now, of course, levies, I think, are way too good right now, and it kind of makes standing armies not nearly as good as they should be. Of course, it's a balance. You don't want people who get the professional armies institution to just instantly build a couple units of professional army and shit on everybody using levies, because that's not a very fun or compelling thing, right? You also don't want players who get the early professional armies to just be able to Goomba stomp every coalition, Goomba stomp every AI. That, shockingly, is also not very fun. So there has to be a balance, but I think the balance right now is two-sided towards levies, to the point where I'm pretty sure levies actually outperform professional armies until age 3. But now we are in age 3, and you might have been noticing I'm just sort of mass conquering. We took basically the entire north, shoved it into 2 different vassals. With my vast wealth of income, I built up these vassals, and each of them was giving me like 60 gold of income. So I had managed to become a kingdom because we had enough prestige, because Florence gets so many events for all these painters and inventors and all this stuff. It took outrageous. I was giving Michelangelo like 2,000 gold to give me like 10 innovation. Like, he had enough money to found his entire city. But okay. The gold costs of some of these events scaled up a little bit, shockingly high, right? So our innovation was at 100, which just helped our research gain, and we were able to just get technologically far more advanced than people, once we had the tactics advantage, the morale advantage, we were almost going even in casualties. Almost. I mean, the Florence army quality still was pretty crap, but at least we had very high tier units, and we had, high tier technologies, so it went pretty well. We shoved North Italy into mostly 2 vassals while integrating Genoa over here, at which point I thought, look, I'm making so much money, why don't I just go for the Italy formation? So we destroyed the Pope, we started mass conquering Naples. The funny thing is, when I did start mass conquering Naples, Tunis ran up, they took Sardinia, they took Corsica, so there was just a giant Tunis in control of all the islands. I hadn't taken Sicily. They did try to take Sicily, but what I had done is I rivaled Tunis, so I was able to join wars against them. And when Tunis actually declared war on Naples to take Sicily, I took Naples' side in the war, joining against Tunis, so that they would screw off and not take Sicily as well, because they were just enslaving all the Italians on these islands. Now, because I was mass conquering Naples, I owned Napoli itself, I owned most of Rome itself. There were some coalitions that tried to fire in me, but I preemptively declared into them just so I could get long truce timers with these people. But I declared war now on Tunis, and it didn't really go that great. I massively overestimated my ability to continue to have food on Sardinia. I'm not really sure what caused my inability to maintain my food stockpiles. I had 3 supply wagons. At either rate, once we landed our army on Sardinia, Tunis landed their army on Sardinia, we ran out of food, started to attrition, took some good battles with them, and 30,000 Tuscans died. So we painfully and slowly, with my massive income, rebuilt 30,000 troops. We shipped them to Sardinia, this time with 3 supply caravans, and they all starved and died a second time. So we built a 3rd army, shipped them over to Sardinia, and most of them died, but enough managed to take a fort that Tunis at this point was finally willing to peace out. We took half of Sardinia, which I don't believe even had 100,000 people on it to compensate for the war. But we did win. Tunis didn't win, we won. And yeah. So at this point, I decided maybe we should put more supply wagons on our armies, and we should increase the size of our navy considerably, at the very least transport ships, so that if we did end up in a situation where we needed to rapidly get our army off the island, we could have one trip instead of needing like 3 or 4 trips to ship them to and back from the island, which allowed often Tunis to ambush and kill us. At one point we raised 20,000 levies to ship to the island. They died too. There's lots of deaths on the island. I think an entire generation of my countrymen were dead on Sardinia, but we took half of Sardinia, and no one can take that away from me. At this point, my run was about ending because I was kind of doing stupid things. I had managed to fight off the entire coalition. My infinite money allowed me to just raise an outrageously large standing army, which I then allow, I think, at 50,000 troops at this point. I was very much capable of fighting any coalition the AI could do. Bulgaria at one point had managed to take Rome. I got them off Rome. I don't know why Bulgaria was possibly there. I did see the event for Rome is that if you conquer Rome, you release only the territory of Rome, but otherwise you can keep the entire rest of the province. Now, I formed Italy once I managed to annex the top 2 vassals, because you need to own Milan. It's Milan, Florence, and Naples you need to own for it, as well as like 80% of the Italian formable. I formed it. It was formed, and then I was kind of looked around and was like, okay, neat. Through Florence just having infinite money, well, not literally infinite, but through Florence having a lot of money multipliers, but no army quality, I formed Italy and didn't really know what to do with the rest of the run because, okay, now I had Italy, and that's about where we ended it. The army quality of Florence, definitely, I don't know, I kind of realized at the end of it, though, the problem is you seem to get discipline for the percent of your primary accepted culture that is your nobility. A lot of my nobility was not a primary or accepted culture, particularly because I kept conquering things like the Ligurians, the Lombards, and we didn't have the culture capacity to accept them, so my discipline wasn't exactly the greatest. That seems to be a penalty for conquering too much shenanigans like that. The other, well, yeah, that seemed to be the big cause here. In addition to Florence itself not having any army quality, the Italy formable also doesn't have any army quality. And you might not believe this, but the Tuscan formable also doesn't have any army quality. In EU4, I think Tuscany had 5 discipline. When none of the other Italians had 5 discipline, Tuscany had 5 discipline, which helped it at least be a little bit relevant. But that doesn't happen in EU5. And particularly, I've learned every game I play, I can play out a very long time. And in this one, I kind of learned one little problem is that you need to keep your primary culture, at the very least your accepted culture, is very large, because if you don't, then your army quality will take a very big hit. And that's the Florence run. It's a very slow burn until I got to about the early 1400s, mid 1400s. The money situation just started spiraling out of control due to Florence's modifiers, and I reached the point where I was just sort of building projects just to be funny, giant road systems, or Florence itself was so over building cap, it took me like 8,000 gold to just build a line of tool workshops on it, and I just did it because I was like, okay, let's just employ more people in Florence. Lots of raw materials in Italy as well. Main issue is food. Compared to all the other runs, I had to like min-max this food so hard. I mean, again, when I'm talking like giga food provinces, now North Italy has food. They've got wheat on rivers, on farmlands. Like North Italy can produce a good chunk of food, but Central Italy and South Italy, not so good with the food. So in particular, because I'd given North Italy to 2 vassals that I eventually did annex, but they hadn't built up their food. So once I did get up there, I had to build all the irrigation, I had to build all the farming villages, I had to build up the food RGOs to begin with. Down in Naples was the same problem. The AI seems to dramatically underbuild food right now, which meant that every time I took their land, everybody was starving and I had to feed them myself. I'm assuming the AI was just paying other people for food. and not trying to supply it themselves, which, as I've said, it's a tax on your income, which is not good. It's not good. You want to supply your own food. So I finally had gotten some of my territories to the highest food generation I've ever seen, simply because I had so many pops on them that they were able to manage so many jobs. I mean, I'm talking 500 food from some territories. When a very large city can eat 300 food, I was generating 500 food out of many different territories trying to feed Italy. Even then, I was not able to feed it. I was actually still importing food from other areas. So if I did the run again, the two main things I would try to do is maintain my cultures, or at least my accepted cultures, a bit better, as well as try to maintain food a bit more, so I didn't kind of reach that mid-run level where I just wasn't generating enough food for it to work. So there's a Italy AAR. There's also, I mean, I'm skipping over a lot of the micromanagement I did, but it's hard to, like, when I'm doing this, to tell you guys, like, I was microing this city to get lots of lumber. I was microing this city to get lots of masonry. I was like, that's kind of how I play the game. Again, I play like very closed in on the game, very much trying to micro all my cities to get different goods out of them. And that's fun for me, but maybe it's a bit hard to describe for you guys. I mean, there's many points where I was building lumber mills, because Italy does not have very good lumber RGOs. They have a couple, so you have to build lumber mills. Any area that's wooded, you can build a lumber mill on it, and that's obviously not as good as a lumber RGO, and it uses lots of tools, but it is an option, and it's, for, I would say for the majority of countries, that's going to be your only option, right? So I had like tens of thousands of people employed in getting lumber in like 5-6 provinces. There was also definitely an iron shortage. There's iron in North Italy, not so much iron in South Italy. So we had to build a bunch of jank iron smelters that I think they turn charcoal or something into iron. Now, I'm not sure in real life you can do that, but it's kind of their way of not screwing over countries that have no source access to really good iron. I don't, maybe that is historically. I've never heard of it, but maybe it is. I should probably go look up on them. So the large population that we had gotten in Italy was actually being employed entirely. And I think that's what makes some of these runs more interesting, is sometimes if I'm playing Moscow, I don't really have lumber issues, right? I build up some lumber RGOs and you can keep those prices down pretty much the entire game. In Italy, we have food problems, we got wood problems, but boy, we have really good urban environments that we can use, particularly as Florence. We can have so much production efficiency. We got really good urban environments. We just have to keep these areas churning with the base resources that they need, and then they just turn into a money printer. But of course, as always, the problem with Italy in every Europa game seems to be the army quality, which is we don't have it. In fact, it's not even a Europa game. It's pretty much every Paradox game. Is there a single Paradox game where Italy has actual good army quality? I don't think so. At any rate, that's this. If you guys listened along, that's great. If you didn't listen along, I'm wondering, how are you listening to me right now? But thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being here. Please make sure to like, please make sure to subscribe. And as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.